afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are. This is Nilima, and I welcome you all here today. I lead the marketing function at MergerWare. I'm sure most of us agree that right from bootstrapped startups to Fortune 500 companies, we find businesses today are increasingly prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Today's forward thinking organizations recognize that a commitment to DEI isn't just a matter of ethics, it's a strategic advantage. In the context of preserving a robust DEI culture throughout M&A activities, we see corporate leaders encountering a significant challenge that is none other than understanding and harmonizing the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies of the entities they are merging with or acquiring. The key to solving this challenge is the knowledge and adept implementation of a thorough DEI strategy. Now, taking this a step ahead, we at MergerWare are pleased to welcome you all here today for this webinar, Driving Value Through DEI in Deals. We have with us two eminent speakers here today, Julie Van Waveren and Carly McCoy. Carly McCoy is a principal in Mercer's M&A advisory business and is the lead for Mercer's Culture in Transaction solution. Carly spends her time working on deals across the deal lifecycle, focusing on culture, DEI, leadership, and talent-related issues. Julie Van Waveren is a partner in Mercer's M&A advisory business and is a lead for Mercer's Talent Insights and ESG transaction solutions. Julie is a sociologist by education, a people strategist by profession, and a DEI activist by passion. She works across the entire deal lifecycle, helping solve and plan for talent and DEI related issues. Together, Julie and Carly will share with us insights about the transformative power of DEI. I would now like to invite Julie and Carly to please take the stage. Welcome, Julie. Welcome, Carly.
Thank you, Nilima, and hi, everyone. Very excited to share some of the learnings on the DEI space today. We have two agenda topics that we'll cover in the time that we have together. The first one is sharing a bit of overview, right, from a macro standpoint, business and people trends that are impacting transactions today. And then the second one is a deep dive on DEI and how companies can move from just being DEI as a risk and checking the box to creating value in deals. So that's most of the discussion today, and we'll share some client stories to better put like a sort of anecdotes to that. So starting from a macro standpoint, right? If we think about DEI, organizations today are facing multiple forces that are shaping the DEI landscape. So from a global risk standpoint, there are, let's say, the return of older risks, topics such as inflation, cost of living crisis that our employees are going through, trade wars, a widespread of social unrest and geopolitical confrontation, all of those which are making and impacting not only governments and countries, but also organizations, and also to newer impacts from the post-pandemic work around parity, the increase in health and well-being, the shift in generational preferences. So there are multiple forces that are coming into play that we as our own organizations and leaders need to manage. Today is a discussion not on why DEI is key. This is not to think about it just as social justice. Today, Carly and I want to invite you to discuss on how DEI is a strategy to sustain high business performance. It impacts quality of talent in an organization, it impacts employee loyalty, a company's reputation, the workforce, the environment and experience, you name it. And in deals specifically, DEI impacts growth, the ability to scale, and delivering the deal value. Now, if we think of it from a CEO or from a leadership standpoint or a business standpoint, what's interesting is that in our research, Mercer recent research, whilst almost 60% of CEOs and CFOs expect demand of products and services to grow, They see talent and people as their #1 challenge in delivering growth and meeting the demand. So there's a common theme here that has taken our thought process lately, which is how many deal teams just check the box on talent and DEI, or even worse, don't address it up front with the right level of depth and disciplined approach. We need to get a lot better, do better, and perform better in topics such as culture, talent, and DEI as M&A professionals. That's why today is such an important topic for us to discuss as we think of people on culture, talent, and DEI at the center of delivering the value in every deal. So let's dive deeper on how people impact deals specifically with some of the research and trends that Carly will share.
Absolutely. So there's no debating that in a deal, across all phases of the deal, the stakes of ignoring people risk is high and has significant implications on deal value. Recent research that we've done in Mercer's Global Talent Trends report show that at the top of the organization, this is very clear. Talent challenges weigh heavy on executives' minds. The #1 people risk for CEOs are the talent skills gaps impacting their growth agenda. And 89% of executives see their organizations as being impacted by the loss of talent. This shows up and has significant implications on the financial results of transactions. And the people and talent issues that are key drivers in M&A or not addressing those issues can really impact the realization of deal value. 47% of transactions fail to meet financial targets by not addressing people-related risks. And an alarming 70% of transactions see productivity loss, customer disruption, flight of key talent, and delayed synergies as a drag on achieving expected values. And even more so for employees that are going through a transaction, it can affect individuals' health. 8% likelihood of employees have an 8% likelihood of being diagnosed with depression, and an increased 5% likelihood of being admitted to the hospital in a merger or an acquisition situation, which has even more impact on the broader workforce and on the business, on customer relationships, and it can prevail throughout the organization, which is substantial. As Julie mentioned earlier, the key aspects of a people strategy that derail risks really show up. Kind of the top 3 are always in leadership issues, culture, and talent or lack of a talent strategy. What we always see in our research and also really in our experience are leadership and culture sitting at the top, and a failure to address leadership alignment, organizational culture, and the critical few components of the culture, often which sit within the talent and DEI strategy, can have really substantial impacts on deal success. And then we also, in terms of the longer term value of deals, our research shows that culture, organization design, and communication have a substantial impact on driving deal outcomes. So managing effective communication strategies that take into consideration the people, talent, and culture related issues that are undercovered in diligence can really have a strong impact on the success of a deal, both in the shorter term integration, but in the longer term integration as well.
That's great, Carly. So look, this reinforces the messaging, right? That addressing culture, talent, and DEI effectively in a deal can either or enhance your value creation strategy or derail it, right? And that's part of the statistics or research that we wanted to show. Now, 2 takeaways on this slide as a framing of thinking about DEI in deals and value enablement. The first one is that to get the value creation right, we as deal teams need to better align the talent platform and the operating platform, right? Meaning that the earlier we start assessing and thinking about culture enablers, people strategy, and DEI priorities, the more chances we have of succeeding as a business and delivering on the deal rationale. And the second one is that very rarely do we see DEI as a separate work stream in deals. So we see this in like sort of leading companies in the world, but every deal team assumes it's being looked at any other, like let's say in the other work streams, right? Compensations is looking at bits and pieces, and benefits is looking at it, but it really works where it's standing on its own. So we need to stop thinking of DEI of bits and pieces and have it in one single strategy to better impact the value drivers and value creation. So that as sharing some of our thinking. And now the other piece of the story is, look, we've seen at the trends, right? We've seen at the research, there's a framework and drivers to enable value. So which are the questions that are DEI related that leading companies are trying to solve for, right? So we put together this from the amount of deals that we run a year, client conversations, and these are the challenges and the tough questions that mature acquirers are asking themselves around leadership, culture, and talent, right? So have you seen there are some that have to do with the quality of the leadership style, how can we better understand and engage and retain talent? How do we better plan around it? What are the critical components of the talent and the culture equation to retain? If you look at each one of these questions, DEI is embedded into it. So again, to my previous point, we need to stop thinking of DEI as something separate and checking the box in terms of risks and liabilities, and think that for each one of these critical components of the value creation in a deal, that is leaders leading a strategy, the culture supporting the operating model and environment, and the talent driving and executing on that strategy, is driven mostly at the heart by DEI and the actions associated to that. And the last one before we dive into some client stories is to talk about what deal teams can do about it, right? So what do we do from a deal standpoint and the different deal life cycle elements? So we have the buy side, and DEI can be a driver for that. The sell side also, not very often do we see DEI in the equation here, but it has a high value for an exit strategy. And then from a PE and corporate side in terms of modeling behaviors and modeling actions, right? So if we, and here what we've tried to do is, if you think across DEI, across the deal life cycle, which are pragmatic actions that you can take as deal teams. So you have all the way from assessing DEI risks and gaps on the left-hand side, and there what we always say is not only look at representation data like, I don't know, percentage of women in the executive team or anything that speaks to representation, but mostly look at access, policies and practices around culture, leadership, and the HR policies and practice that speak to access, to opportunity, to equity in terms of how people are managed. And very importantly is the employee experience and belonging. So it is true that depending on the deal phase, it's not only always easy to access this, but is one that we would call out and flag very specifically in early post-close, is understanding what is the employee experience and belonging in general to the organization, and specifically in terms of feeling included and that there are equity in practices, right? So this is mostly what we would recommend to see. Many companies are already doing this. Of course, the ESG and regulatory environment are helping drive some of these. But again, we see a lot on checking the box from a risk and liability standpoint and taking less of a time to really assess in a lot more depth leadership style, culture, ways decisions are made, etc., and how that has a DEI component to it. And from a sales side standpoint, this is a strategy, right? So forward-thinking organizations are already positioning DEI in that value curve and value continuum. We share a story around that, but mostly on showing where the company was and where it is, and how the DEI actions and initiatives that the company has driven can facilitate and inhibit value creation, right? So a lot of this has to do to not only accredit the strategy and the value that it has created, but position DEI as one of those value drivers from a people standpoint in deals. And last but not least, we would say is, how do we model that, right? So from a buyer standpoint or even from a private equity standpoint, we've seen a big shift here in the past, I would say 2 to 3 years, in not only setting standards, but mostly ensuring that there's a connectivity that is modeling the buyer or the PE, the behaviors around DEI, defining it as a key driver or a key distinction of their brand, and ensuring that when they go into a deal or an acquisition in a transaction or a PE with a portfolio company, there's leadership alignment around the DEI priorities. Why is it top in the agenda for the PE or the corporate buyer, and which are like sort of the supporting journey or roadmap that needs to get into place to ensure that that is a priority and that targets are met. So a bit on how DEI plays out in the entire ecosystem. So I'll pause there. We went from trends and risks, we went into how to think about deals, then how do deal teams execute DEI, and now we wanted to dive into like pragmatic actions and how companies are addressing it. So we'll share with you 2 client stories, one in pre-close and the other one in post-close, to better visualize what are actions and concrete actions that deal teams can take. And Carly, I turn it to you.
Thank you. So just to kind of double click and provide a real life example on the DEI due diligence and what it exactly is that organizations can do to uncover some of the risks and opportunities is this particular case study. It was a global technology company acquiring another technology company similar size, however, we were engaged to support them on culture and DEI diligence because there was a perception that the organizations, while having a very similar mission and vision and similar talent acquisition strategy, at the surface level, were not really aligned from a culture and ways of working or DEI strategy perspective. And so together with the deal team, we performed diligence through leadership assessment, reviewing practices, policies, procedures, and all components that support the talent and operating platform, as well as the specific components of the DEI strategy, trying to really get at some of these questions that you see here on the left. And to Julie's point earlier, these are really questions that we see deal teams asking and that they need to answer to really uncover what is critical to understand, what is critical to maintain or integrate in the short term and the long term, depending on the deal strategy. And what we did, so we literally completed DEI due diligence on programs, policies, and pay, and broader culture diligence on the operating environment to understand kind of this concept of the critical few, what really mattered to employees. But more so, it was testing the connection between what leaders were saying at the top to how DEI, culture, talent, the components of the talent strategy were really showing up to employees, driving business outcomes. And we were able to align leaders and deal teams on the key findings and the success drivers from a culture and DEI perspective, and then provide some longer term DEI integration strategy components as they thought about the holistic integration strategy. So as Julie mentioned earlier, there are pieces of this that show up when you're thinking about how you review, compensation practices, how you review talent acquisition, onboarding, and some of the softer components of your mentoring programs and key programs that really drive employees engagement with the workforce, engagement with their managers, their own employee experience and career framework, but also that drive and motivate them to work as a team, to collaborate and to support the business objectives and their go-to-market strategies. So this is typically what we see organizations do that do this well and that do this early. And this can be done, again, in a post-close environment as well. But as soon as deal teams are aligned on the steps and what this looks like, the more successful the outcomes tend to be.
Thank you, Carly. That was great. Yeah, so that's a great example of pre-close. I'll share now an example in the private equity space, and I'll clarify when we walk through the story, you'll see a lot of similarities on what can be done from a corporate standpoint in post-close from a DEI perspective. So private equity, 1 billion assets under management, based in the US. They had two questions that they wanted to solve for, or two issues, let's say, they wanted to solve for. The first one is, we want to lead the space in terms of diversity in the private equity sector. So mostly white male Americans that are in this sector today. I wanted to shift and take the charge and lead as a private equity on being a lot more diverse and ensuring that stick to the brand. So from a brand position as a private equity, that was the first issue. And the second one was, if we want to achieve that, we need our portfolio companies to mirror that. So how do we ensure to, every time we integrate a portfolio company, or that they're in the different maturity levels and curves from a DEI standpoint, that we can accompany that journey? So essentially the work that we did is in three big phases, right? The first one was, let's design and let's identify the different maturity curves in DEI. And this is very important because every time we acquire a company, their DEI practices are in different maturity levels. It's a journey, right? So we often see companies that have it very structured and embedded across all their practices, other times not. Some companies might not even have it structured, but it's part of their culture. So the first step was to design or to map out the different phases of maturity that the private equity wanted to assess against each portfolio company, right? So you'll see from foundational practices to proactive at leveling, and then to leading practices. And we mapped out what the roadmap could look like from a maturity standpoint. And then that was like sort of the baseline to assess each portfolio company and where they were at, right, in terms of maturities and actions. And then what were current state of actions, but mostly which were gaps and priority areas, depending on the industry that the portfolio company was in, the maturity of its DEI practices, and the people issues or challenges that they needed to address to scale and grow quicker, right? So for some, it was related to hiring. For others, for example, they had some portfolio companies in the healthcare space. It was all about retaining critical talent. So each one had a component of that, of current state, of maturity of its practices, and next phase of evolution. And the third one was, which were the key drivers where DEI could accelerate or augment depending on the business strategy and the people strategy that delivered on business results. And then very pragmatically, the third step on the right-hand side was, okay, you need some framework to do this, right? So how I, as a portfolio company, address this. So it was all the support around building a specific DEI roadmap for each portfolio company in very pragmatic actions. And then what was consolidated at the PE level, but also specifically for each portfolio company, was the dashboard, which are the key metrics that you as a portfolio company need to report to from a board positioning standpoint. So it was the overall design and execution of implementation of looking at current state and maturity, looking at priority areas and what would drive growth and scale. And the second one which are pragmatic actions and how do we measure value and progress that is being created with this journey. And from all of this came a lot of learning, right? So What we did ensure is to build out of all the stories at the portfolio company, what we call the best practice toolkit and some workshops where each portfolio company could share quarterly, which were like progress against priorities and challenges, and also what were lessons learned from business leaders and from HR to better progress in this space, right? So very interested in terms of overall approach. And what I would say is, although this is a private equity story, if you think about a corporate deal or acquisition, it's very similar in what we can address from a process standpoint, right? Is what are integration priorities? What's the gap assessment or maturity level? How can I have different acquisitions during the course of a year with different maturity curves and journeys from a DEI standpoint? And how do I ensure that there's a clear roadmap for action and then for reporting on progress and metrics? So more to come on this, but very exciting in terms of what companies are doing to lead in this space and how this is changing the impact and success in deals from a people standpoint. So a bit of the final considerations as we end our discussion. So with Carly, we thought that these were three critical ones, right? The first one is a change in the mindset, right? Is we say this one and time again, is that DEI has to stop being like checking the list or saying, oh, we are acquiring a company and they have nothing on DEI. Well, that is already a messaging, right? So it's not just checking the boxes, thinking of DEI as culture and people strategy. So understand that the quality and the competitiveness of the culture and the talent, we think it's key. And we share that, and we've shared in other forums, and there's a lot of collateral that you can access on how deal teams are doing this, and you can get a lot better in understanding that. And then one that is very pragmatic, but that we see a lot, is from a buyer standpoint or for a PE standpoint, articulating what is critical and non-negotiable, what is important. You need to align leadership teams early on in the deal life cycle on why DEI is important to drive value and business results, and how it is embedded across the employee life cycle and practices from an HR priority standpoint. So that's the first one. The second one is getting a lot more savvy, right? So if we think about all the talk today on we need to keep on evolving as deal teams, we need to upskill ourselves, the deal landscape is changing. This is the one that we think that it will really move the needle. That is deal teams that are a lot more savvy on understanding, assessing, and speaking culture, talent, and DEI, and not leaving this as if it would be an HR topic, right? We as deal teams need to get to be a lot smarter on how we assess this and speak to it so that we can impact the strategy. And last but not least, I leave it to Carly because I know that she's very passionate about the getting things done and ensuring that the value of the deal is delivered.
Yeah. So finally, I mean, the same way that you would, when building out your integration plan, short-term and long-term, you would assign leaders and integrate and embed those components of the plan into their goals, into their objectives, is what you need to do for your DEI plan. So holding leaders accountable, clarifying who has decision-making authority and who is ultimately accountable for the components of the DEI plans in order to accelerate the people components of your integration and deals is critical. And modeling out that value stabilization phase. So understanding the people and talent needs across the value and the value stabilization phase, so that 1, 2, 3, 4 years post close, truly having an understanding of all of those components, where the components of the DEI plan stands up shows up, and making sure that you have, as I said, that accountability in place. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, in diligence and all the way through, DEI is not just what leaders say, it's the actions, and how it shows up in the organization and the connectivity between the two. And that's what's most important from a DEI perspective. And then finally, as we mentioned a lot of research in this conversation today. Everything you can find on our website on Mercer.com. And this information will be shared with all of you as a follow-up, and never hesitate to reach out if you have any questions on anything discussed today or anything you see here.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Gali. I think that has been great in terms of the information that has been shared here. I think our audience today will deeply benefit from the best practices that have been shared. We now have a few questions that we've received. So shall we begin with the Q&A round?
Please.
Sure.
Great, great. So the first question that I would like to present here is, how can we augment the learnings on culture, talent, and DEI with AI in deals?
So Carly, I'll take that on. Yeah, this is a very exciting topic, right? And we know that there's a lot of the AI talk nowadays. And that's what we were saying is, look, we as deal teams need to leverage a lot more tools and get a lot more smarter in terms of assessing culture, talent, and DEI. So what does that mean specifically to that question that is super interesting is that there are platforms, there is technology, there are talent intelligence platforms mostly that we can leverage as deal teams today to get data even in the early stages of a deal with publicly available info that can infer what a culture looks like, what's the quality of the talent of a target, and how diverse it is. So that we find that it's a game changer in this space, right? And one that I like to think of that we don't have the benefit today to say, I don't know too much of those topics in a target, because there's a lot out there that we can learn on how a company is managed, of how people are managed, and then how DEI is part of the culture and the heart of a company. So just to summarize, yes, there's a lot there. We as Mercer partner with a lot of the leading companies in the AI space from an M&A standpoint, and there's a lot that we can leverage for quick people decisions, for quick learning on culture and talent and skills, and understand a lot better that in the deal life cycle.
Thank you, Julie. I think the audience and me both agree that diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer buzzwords for us. We have benefited immensely by being here. Thank you to both of you, Julie and Kali, for sharing the learnings with us. For our audience, should you have any queries, you can write to us at insights@MergerWare.com. We also have mentioned the email addresses of Julie and Kali as well. So feel free to reach out to them as well. Thank you again. Have a nice day. Take care.